Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Today I am joined by Matt Kibbe, who has done graduate work in economics at George Mason University. He received his BA in economics from Grove City College and has a mind-blowing documentary called The Cover-Up on Blaze TV. Check him out at freethepeople.org. Mr. Kibbe, where is the best place for people to watch The Cover-Up?
So it's co-produced by Blaze TV. So if you're a subscriber to Blaze TV, you can see it first. It is also on YouTube at Blaze TV. It is on Free the People's website as well. And we've been publishing on Twitter because we feel like that's the one place that it won't get struck down by the nanny state authorities that don't want us to talk about things like what the government's doing to our health.
Excellent. What I want to do is get into economics. And once I get an idea of where you are economically, I want to then apply that knowledge to lockdowns, mask mandates, and the health and human services. What is the best definition of economics that you think is most productive for people to know?
So economics to me is the study of the process of people figuring stuff out. Ludwig von Mises talked about economics as a process, the market as a process. It's not a thing, it's not a place. It's just people thinking about what they need in the future in a radically uncertain world, working through that world. And I think about it very much through the lens of Mises and Frederick Hayek. So I think about it almost in terms of sociology. I don't always think about downward sloping demand curves. I don't always think about supply and demand. I think about that knowledge-seeking process that defines human behavior.
I love that definition because any definition that's about, well, it's about the unemployment rate and GDP. It doesn't get into the nature of economizing. So walk me through the different ways that I would economize or the incentives I would face, whether I'm a state official or someone in the private sector. What are the different incentives that these groups face, or the same person acting in two different capacities?
So whenever I analyze public policy or anything that people are prescribing to make the world a better place, I think of two filters. One is knowledge, and this comes from Hayek, but the other is incentives, and it comes from James Buchanan and public choice. I was a student when James Buchanan won the Nobel Prize for his radical notion that once you become a public official, you don't lose your incentive to behave as a private individual. In other words, we're all selfish, we're all self-interested, and the problem with public officials is they don't either have the knowledge to do the sort of reorganizing, even central planning that they want to do, but they also don't have the right incentives because there's no magical button that you can press that makes someone suddenly public interested instead of self-interested. So you end up with self-dealing and perverse incentives and people doing things that are very much against the public interest when you give them that much power and that much authority to rearrange things from the top down. The difference between that and you and I is that we have to suffer the consequences of the decisions we make. We don't get a special get out of jail free card. We don't get special access to power to coerce other people to do what we want. If we want other people to engage with us in trade or something else, we have to figure out win-win scenarios. We have to voluntarily cooperate. We have to persuade. And that is a fundamentally different paradigm than ultimately the violence that government officials can wield against you. So again, they don't have the knowledge they think they can have. That only comes from the market process itself. And they certainly don't have angel wings that the rest of us don't have. They're just as self-interested as we are, and it creates lots of problems.
The fact that they don't face the discipline of competition or the freedom of others to disassociate, I always wonder, if, much like the welfare state, it might help people in the moment with a high time preference, but it almost doesn't even help them in the long run. I think of the kid who gets every single thing he asks for from his parents, is very happy for the first 10 seconds he gets the thing. But in the long run, he's just on this hedonic treadmill of always wanting the next thing. When we give these politicians $6.27 trillion a year, they don't say, hey, I just want to give a speech and thank all the taxpayers and all the businesses who comply with the regulations. We're so appreciative of you guys. They're like, look, here's a new tax we can have on the wealthy. Here's a new social security tax. Here's a new. They never have enough when it comes to the amount of money they want. Neither do people in the private sector, but at least we can disassociate with them. When it comes to big economic fallacies, what are the big economic fallacies or errors in thinking that the average person, average voter will come across? And what do they need to know about to decrease the likelihood they could get manipulated by the Donald Trumps or Bernie Sanderses of the world?
So I'm going to give you a wonky answer because I think it's fundamental to other answers I would give. The biggest fallacy about economics is that somehow it is the science the same way that a quadratic equation can be solved. And this again was the fundamental Austrian critique of neoclassical economics, the sort of pseudoscience of modern economics that tries to reduce human beings into numbers and equations and X's and Y's. Um, if you think about economics that way, you would be you might have the conceit to think that you could manipulate those X's and Y's to nudge us in a different direction and produce better outcomes. This is the fatal conceit of central planners, but it's also the fatal conceit of anyone that wants to write legislation to rework the healthcare economy, to rework our relationships with foreign countries when it comes to trade, anything else. You can apply it to everything. And, Bastiat talked about it as the unintended consequences, the seen and the unseen. I think about it as more of a fatal conceit and arrogance. And quite often in politics and in policy, and here I'm in Washington, D.C., and I am surrounded by people that are certain that they're smarter than the rest of us. And it's that belief that you can sort of manipulate people like we're on a chessboard or a checkerboard. That can be applied to any critique we would have of some dumb government policy and the unintended consequences that flow from that.
So, I'm familiar with this as the chess piece fallacy. People can be moved around in society just like you can move around chess pieces on a board. Walk me through that. Take any example, whether it's lockdowns, the minimum wage, antitrust, tariffs. Can you give us a real world example and walk us through how the chess piece fallacy can be detrimental to one's thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I've been obsessed about lockdowns for the last since March of 2020. I initially thought it was so insane that even our government wouldn't agree to do something like imagining, and I think it was Trump that actually said that he could flip a switch and turn the economy back on. Well, like, of course, the economy's not a machine that you can turn on and off. And I actually went back to Frederick Bastiat. I wrote a piece in early March of 2020, and I went back to this great essay that Frederick Bastiat has in Economic Sophisms, where he talks about the marvel of how Paris is fed. It's a sort of magically people sleep at night knowing that when they wake up, there will be bread available to them. They eat. They don't have any conception of the infinitely complex process and all the workers and all the talents and all of the division of labor and the inputs that led to that wonderful occurrence of, hey, there's bread for breakfast, I'm going to be fine. They just sleep in peace knowing that somehow this magically happens. And I think that was the ultimate unintended consequence. Let's assume it was unintended. I don't want to believe that anyone was evil enough to want to create all of the collateral damage caused by lockdowns, particularly people at the margin. Jay Bhattacharya talks about this a lot. The people in India who are living day by day based on their ability to sell coconuts in a market. and you shut that down, and those people starve. This doesn't seem like a particularly unintended consequence, because if you know anything about economics, and if you know anything about the way that the economy functions, we should have anticipated that. Even our dumbest politicians should have anticipated that. So lockdowns created uncountable collateral damage, by putting people out of work, by locking people in their homes, and now we're allowed to acknowledge that this damage has actually been caused. We're allowed to talk about teen suicide. We're allowed to talk about people who are alcoholics now because they were deemed non-essential, by government bureaucrats. By the way, a department within Homeland Security is where they determined whether or not you were essential or non-essential. So it's a fatal conceit on an almost militaristic level, where they had the arrogance to think that they could basically militarize the economy, shut down certain segments, and then magically turn it back on when they thought they were done with us.
It is so sickening just to remember the fact that they said some people are essential and others are non-essential. I mean, we would be, by definition, in an apartheid state if they said every 4 years you people can vote and you people cannot vote. That would be an apartheid state. However, when they say you can spend 40 hours of a week doing what you want, you people cannot spend 40 hours a week doing what you want. Well, that is much more of a violation of my desires, my rights, my wants, my expression of who I am, than getting a 1 in 4 vote between two lying politicians once every 4 years. This was absolutely completely criminal. All right, where do I want to go with this? Um, let's say that I have a theory. Lockdowns, which you are critical of, how dare you, saved lives. How can I falsify that theory?
I mean, you could go through the data, and we've all become amateur epidemiologists, but I defer to people much smarter than me when I talk about these things. Jay Bhattacharya has run through this data, and so has his co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which I think everybody knows about. And you can readily see that even in places like New Zealand, an island nation that pretty much put a wall around their country, people eventually got sick, and those most vulnerable to this virus or any other virus, it was going to happen. And I get in an argument with some of my libertarian friends that were pro lockdown, and they hemmed and hawed about it. You probably know some of the people I'm talking about. Um, and it gets back to that fatal conceit, because even if let's assume that lockdowns work, and let's assume that public officials have the incentives and knowledge to do lockdown rights. In order for them to know that a novel virus has emerged in the population, and we now think that the coronavirus probably showed up in the United States in late 2019, not 2020. You would have to have such a health surveillance state. Um, think about some of the scenes you saw in Red China, where people are lined up on a daily basis to get tested. I still don't think it works, but let's assume that this authoritarian scientific method actually works. You would have to be constantly surveilling and controlling and dominating people to even hope to detect patient zero. I think it's impossible, but I think they would love to try. And you can see all of the pandemic plans, a lot of the planners that are so guilty of what happened. Their whole thing is we gotta lock down harder. We gotta test harder. We have to monitor. We have to change human behavior. I don't know if you ever read it, but Anthony Fauci actually wrote this piece in a journal called Cell, where he imagined uh, bending modernity, including like world travel and trade and how we live and how we gather. He goes down the whole list, and he says we have to change all of that if we want to be pandemic proof. And I'm like, That sounds like my worst nightmare. And also, by the way, it's impossible. It's not possible, but this is how central planners think about the world.
Yeah, even if it is possible, I don't know how desirable
Yeah.
any
It
living
seems
like
not so much, yeah.
like that would be. That they're always trying to protect the vulnerable. Was just amazing to see the people who said, "I'm for the working class. We need to empower them with getting someone like Bernie or Elizabeth Warren elected," and then the masses of the workers were saying, I'm really uncomfortable wearing this face mask 8 hours a day. People can't see my facial expressions. It's harder to communicate, and it's really uncomfortable 8 hours a day. And the psychopaths could not have cared less. And of course, Trump bears the responsibility for the initial 15 days to slow the spread, which they at the time never even said would save lives. They're like, well, this is to stop us from overwhelming the hospitals. In your research, how did they go from convincing the people to lock down for 15, 14 days. And then this turned into like a 2-year nightmare.
Well, Deborah Birx admits in her book, and she was the head of the president's coronavirus task force. Scott Atlas, we're actually premiering on YouTube today the next episode of the Cover Up featuring Scott Atlas, who was like sort of the one dissident in the Trump White House who was questioning masks and vaccine mandates and lockdowns and the whole thing. But Deborah Birx admits that they were lying to us from day one, that they knew that 2 weeks to slow the spread was just political spin and that they intended to do it for months on end. And they've also admitted that there was no science backing up masking or 6 feet distancing. My own view on masking, you were talking about this earlier, masking clearly in hindsight was a training exercise to see if they could condition the American people to comply with something. And it reminds me a little bit of what happened during Mao's Cultural Revolution. One of the things um, Lee, why am I blanking on Lee's name? So one of my friends, Lee Schooland, grew up during Mao's Cultural Revolution, and one of the things that she points out is that they forced women to dress like men, and you've seen these uniforms, right? They're all dressed the same, and what the purpose of that was to strip people of their humanity and treat everybody more like a robot or a number, and everybody's the same, and everybody's interchangeable, and everybody's expendable. I think masking, practically speaking, does the same thing. They were seeing if we would comply with it, and unfortunately, too many Americans did, and that only encourages them to see what else they can get us to comply with. Um, my favorite interview of the period was with Ron Paul, who, as you know, is a physician, and he very early on realized that masking was counterproductive. He might have even called it stupid, which is more on the nose. And of course, that's the one video that YouTube took down from our channel. But it was a ritual about compliance, and it was also sort of a quasi religious thing, right? The science became God, and the rituals became masking and vaccine boosters and stay at home orders, and if you didn't do those things, you became an apostate. You were to be banned. You were to go straight to whatever hell it is that non-believers go to in the science world.
It definitely is ritualistic. In 1839, there is this painting titled Slave Punishment, where a slave has something permanently over his face during whatever amount of punishment he was given that explicitly strips him of his humanity. Now, I'm sure the slave masters were just trying to protect him from a respiratory virus, and there's nothing nefarious about having people cover their mouths for extended periods of time, but I guess Tony Fauci, he is pretty old. Maybe this was him in 1839 handing out these punishments, helping people. When it comes to whether or not they even kept us safe, so we've gone over, it's humiliating. And frankly, it's disgusting. I don't want to look around when I'm at the mall and see people with masks on. I want to see faces, facial expressions. This is actually our humanity. Like Murray Rothbard says, if humans were ants and totally interchangeable, then the human race wouldn't have anything to really be proud of. It's our individuality, and these masks strip us of that individuality. Thomas Woods says that he compared states with mask mandates for a long period of time versus places that either had no mask mandate or a mandate for a very short amount of time. Have you looked into this data, and do you find any reason to believe mask mandates or lockdown mandates saved lives?
Um, I've only looked at it through eyes like Tom. So I've looked at everything that Tom has done over the years, and his book, Anatomy of Psychosis. Is that what it's called? Yeah,
Diary of a Psychosis: How
Diary of a
Public Health
Psychosis.
Disgraced Itself During COVID Mania.
I know that guys like Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya have run the numbers, and what they would say, not just on masking, but on lockdowns versus non-lockdowns. You can look at Sweden, and if you adjust for age, you can see that Sweden did as good, if not better, than a lot of countries that locked down. The challenge is the data is somewhat corrupt. So you have to come up with a proxy for what the right measurement, and the best we can do right now is excess death. And it is pretty clear to me that the collateral damage of the excess death numbers in heavy lockdown countries and heavy lockdown states is a very significant factor. And to me, that's the best thing to do. But I haven't crunched the data myself. I used to do that when I was a younger man, and I now allow smarter people to do that for me.
Well, in Tom's book, I think he does a very good job of persuading us there's no significant difference between states in America that had heavy lockdowns, heavy mask mandates, and states that did the opposite. So, all this inconvenience for absolutely nothing. When it comes to the vaccine, can I ask if you decided to get the vaccine?
So I got J&J, and I got it because my wife. This is a true story. I think we did it in 2021. By the way, I got sick exactly 2 weeks after I got the vaccine, which I don't think is a coincidence. But my wife had to do foreign travel, and we were told that if we submitted to this vaccine, we could go about our lives, which of course was also a lie. But my thinking, not being too sarcastic here, was that if my wife was going to get vaccinated and she turned into a zombie, I would not want to be the husband in The Walking Dead that has to put down his zombie wife. So I figured we would shuffle off together in zombie happiness. So we did that. I immediately got sick. I deeply regret doing it. One, because they lied to me about getting my freedom back, and two, because I'm not at all convinced that I would have gotten sick had I not done that. But who knows? I'm sure some expert will tell me I did the right thing.
So my reasoning, and I actually lied to basically everyone at the time. I told everyone, yes, I got it, just so they would get
Yeah.
off my back. My reasoning was one, it's not just about me being the 28-year-old who fights against the establishment. It's first, the people promoting the product had the worst reputations I could think of. The Tony Fauci's of the world, Donald Trump was pushing Operation Warp Speed. These people did not have the incentive to make sure, hey, we've really done the studies and this looks really good. They just didn't have the reputation. On top of that, the incentives of having no downside, no liability, it's a win-win. If I get it, or it's a win, non-lose. If I get it and it helps me, it's a win. If I get it and I get sick for some reason because these people have terrible reputations and we don't know what they're putting in this, then I don't have the right to sue them. So with those two things, I just said, you know what? I'm not really interested
Yeah.
in this any more than I'd be interested in a cup of Kool-Aid from Guyana. I mean, it's just ridiculous that they were so confident that I should be putting this into my arm. If this vaccine is only lasting a few months and then you have to get boosted, And the big round of boosters hasn't taken place in some long time because they haven't just marketed it to the population. Aren't the vast majority of Americans completely unvaccinated? I would think 90% of people right now are unvaccinated if they haven't kept up with the boosters.
So this gets at so like, and I didn't, as a libertarian that knows very much about what RFK Jr. would call corporate capture, I call it regulatory capture. I certainly knew that big pharma wrote the rules of the game when it came to vaccine production, vaccine approval, primarily creating barriers to entry for smaller medical innovations that might enter the process through this multi-million dollar approval process. I've been writing about this since I was 20 years old. What I didn't understand, and what I've been digging at in this investigative series of Cover Up, is that it's not that uh, there's regulatory capture; it's that there is no bright line at all between the pharmaceutical industry and these government health agencies. There's Rand Paul has talked extensively about the intellectual property kickbacks that staff within the NIH, HHS, whatever, all of these agencies is getting while determining whether or not the vaccines are safe and effective. But I think it's more than that. I think you go back to 2001 and the so-called war on terror. Dick Cheney taps Tony Fauci in this backwater small agency, NIAID, to run his entire grandiose bioterrorism strategy. And a lot of more money pours into that agency. Tony Fauci basically becomes the kingmaker for any sort of medical research that is happening. All the money shifts away from cancer research and other research that I think most Americans would support towards this bioterrorism strategy. And their idea was to create all of these weaponized viruses. They're going to go into the bat caves, they're going to find the dangerous ones, and then they're going to manipulate them, and then they're going to come up with a cure. And they're going to map this out. Tell me if this doesn't sound like a central planning nightmare out of some zombie apocalypse movie. And and in the process of doing all that, they basically captured the pharmaceutical industry. They captured all of the medical research institutes at all of the universities, created an entire ecosystem of NGOs and government agencies that are feeding off of this process. I didn't know all that, and perhaps I was naive to know that. If I had known that, I wouldn't have gone anywhere near this vaccine. And frankly, it's one of the things that I think is interesting. If, let's say, Jay Bhattacharya, as is rumored, gets to be the head of NIH. Let's say that RFK becomes the head of HHS, as he has been nominated to do, and let's say we unwind this corruption of the scientific process itself, and get back to a separation between government and science. Science and state should be separate things. I think that's long overdue, and I think a lot of libertarians get this wrong because we have this almost romantic view of scientific process. This is part of the market process. It's the same process of smart people engaging in debates and figuring stuff out, and making things that allow us to live longer, healthier lives. That is a real thing, but it has been hijacked by the government. And I think a lot of libertarians don't understand just how entwined it is and how militarized the science community has become.
When it comes to other things that scientists or the experts have gotten wrong, it's very clear when you look at, foreign interventions. The experts in national security didn't exactly tell us Libya would devolve into slave trades run by Al Qaeda in Libya if NATO had its 2011 operation in there. But they go, well, that's different. Those are different experts. You can say, well, expert theologians tell us who study theology, tell us that God exists. We have imams, priests, rabbis tell us God exists, and people go, well, those are different experts. These are scientific experts. when it comes to the concept of scientific experts being wrong, what are some historical examples you can use outside of COVID before getting into saying, hey, if they're wrong here, they could be wrong in the present? What are some examples you could use of where the scientists got it wrong?
Well, it's funny. I think so-called foreign policy experts talk about exporting democracy and regime change and all of these pretenses they have. They talk about it very much in a quasi-scientific way. They have data, they have theories, they have a whole vocabulary that they use to make us think that they're a lot smarter than we are. But when you think about the war state, it is going all the way back to war communism under Lenin in the early 17, 18, 19. Um, it is a form of central planning, and it is wrapped in this language of science. Even Marx's whole theory of the arc of history from feudalism to late stage capitalism to socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, all the way to communism. It was science, right? The science is settled. It's the same thing, and I see this sort of militaristic attitude having taken over science itself, and that to me is fundamentally concerning. I'm trying to think of another example that's closer to home. Here,
While you think of that,
sure,
let me give you mine.
okay,
So if we look right here, this is me, and this was on February 14th of 2021. This is when I weighed roughly 290 pounds because I was following this science right here, the food pyramid. In every classroom of mine growing up, you would have a list of the presidents, you'd have the Constitution on the wall, and then you'd have the USDA food pyramid telling you the primary thing you should eat are things like bread, pasta, whole grains, crackers, wheat thins. Thin. The word thin is in the food wheat thin. How could that be adding weight to anyone? So I was on a low fat diet, which had me at 290 pounds, getting no attention from any woman with good vision. And then I came across videos on YouTube for free. This blows the mind of the progressive that says, well, if you have a problem, we need to elect people into government. They have to have committees, they have to have hearings, then they have to pass laws, then they have to have college courses, then you have to go to college for 4 years, and then you can start to, go to doctor's appointments, and then this could eventually be solved. The fact that all you had to do was watch videos on YouTube from people like Ken Berry, people like Laura Spath, it completely blew the mind of people that, well, there's actually something called the carnivore diet, and the USDA's food pyramid is actually what's been making us fat for all this time. Other than that, though, the scientists would never be wrong. When I knew that, I said, well, maybe the scientists are just as corrupt as the rest of us.
yeah. So like I have a friend, Greg Glassman, who founded CrossFit, who was very much a warrior. I mean, he eventually got canceled, and I think he's probably living on a beautiful island somewhere now. But he got canceled because he declared war on processed foods and the corporate interests that had captured the pyramid at the USDA. By the way, rumors that Joel Salatin might take a role at the USDA could be wildly welcome as someone who would also rage against this corporate capture of the system. So I'm not sure the science got wrong. I think corporate capture corrupted the science, and it's almost exactly what happened during COVID. The only people that spoke out against the lockdown regime were canceled. Martin Kulldorff was fired from his prestigious university job, and there's dozens, if not hundreds, of other people that can tell the same story. It's because the cash was flowing in a certain way, and it was a paradigm that could not be questioned. And if you did question that paradigm, you would get ousted. It is the opposite of science. But I think the food pyramid is a great example of that. And I've been talking about this. I'm optimistic about a lot of the voices in the so-called MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again. And again, I think some libertarians are getting this wrong because they don't fully appreciate what corporate capture is all about. But you can solve the corruption of America's food in one of two ways. You could imagine doing better regulation, even though the regulatory process is what created the current system. And I think that would be exactly the wrong way to do it. Or you could unwind a lot of the programs and incentives that created the problem in the first place. And I use one example that I was personally involved. I worked on Capitol Hill in the early mid 1990s. And this is when Newt Gingrich took charge, and they were actually doing some pretty deep cuts in programs. We wanted to eliminate the sugar program. I worked for a Florida congressman. We proposed legislation. We got it into the budget and the appropriations committees. Ultimately, we came one vote short because the sugar guys traded votes with the peanut guys, which is how legislation never gets fixed. Um, but the American Sugar Program is basically a protectionist program that props up the price of sugar produced primarily in Florida, sugar beets in Minnesota, some a little bit in Hawaii still. So it's artificially high, significantly artificially high. And then we subsidize the production of corn. We produce so much corn, don't know what to do with it. We started making high fructose corn syrup, which would not be economically viable if not for the fact that the sugar was artificially high. So now we have this, and I think every honest health scientist appreciates that high fructose corn syrup is pretty much toxic. It's pretty much one of the things driving obesity in children in this country. And instead of banning high fructose corn syrup, I would suggest we stop funding the programs that have created this unintended consequence of this poisonous substitute for sugar. And to me, that's the I want to make sure that well-meaning people that are moving in this same direction, and they're talking about healthy diets, and they're taking on the USDA paradigm, which is totally broken. I want to make sure that they understand that there is, in fact, a libertarian solution to this that would save money and save lives.
I love that way of thinking because it's so indicative of the process of the market. Because so often people will say, who should decide such a thing? Or when they say something like that, they're automatically assuming that some state official is going to be acting on their behalf without accounting for what incentives this person faces. Like, are the people in government going to be up at night saying, God, I hope Matt Kibbe's eating healthy. Let me give him a call. Let me see what he's up to. They got 330 million people to look after, assuming, they actually care in the first place. The incentive structure that you would want to have is to make there be so few barriers to entry that the consumers have the widest range of choices on which foods to consume. The alternative is creating another regulatory apparatus and saying, I hope we get good guys in there. I hope the good guys aren't lying about being good guys. And even the nicest person would rather sometimes watch Netflix or watch YouTube than go out and build something that a homeless person could have shelter in, because humans are naturally self-interested. So I think anything that RFK said, the best thing RFK can do is just use his platform to go around America holding rallies, giving speeches, talking about the carnivore diet or things that people can actually do today to make their children healthier and to make themselves healthier. Like even seeing that there was this McDonald's picture that's going viral. It's
Right.
Trump, Musk, Don Jr., and RFK. And the joke is the health guy is eating McDonald's. McDonald's actually can be very healthy if you do what I do, go up to the drive-thru and say, could I get 6 quarter pounder patties with only salt and nothing on them? And then I put mustard on them. That is totally healthy. That doesn't have all the bread, all the processed carbs, and everything else. The Big Mac patties are a different story. But Wendy's is the main place that I went to when I lost all the weight. I would only get the beef patties and I would fill up on those. So anything else you would like the Maha people to hear as far as things they can actually do in their everyday life that could change outcomes rather than giving more power and prestige to politicians?
Yeah, so I'll talk about Thomas Massey, who's been a regular guest on my show, Kibbe on Liberty on Blaze TV. And if you haven't seen it, everybody should go to freethepeople.org and watch Off the Grid with Thomas Massey, the very first documentary we ever made, where he's basically OG Maha before it was even a thing. And one of the things he talks about is beef production and how the beef industrial complex, or I'll call it the meat industrial complex because it involves pork as well, have centralized the system and captured the USDA approval process in a way. And he has legislation called the Prime Act, which essentially allows for a more robust, bottom up, decentralized process for producing beef cattle. I don't think it's an accident that guys like Bill Gates are going directly after the production of beef, and they say it's about climate change, but they also say it's about health. And he says that he's going to make meat in a lab instead, and I'm sure he's got the intellectual property for that, and he's going to get the government to mandate that we eat his lab created meat, which sounds like a dystopian nightmare beyond my imagination. But the alternative, and Nicole Shanahan has been a big voice in this. She was RFK's running mate, someone that also has come from the left. She likes Massey's approach, and she's been a big advocate of Massey being nominated for the Department of Agriculture, which fingers crossed still happens. But you have to decentralize the food system, and this is something that Joel Salatin taught me, because again, going back to my early lockdown take was thinking about Frederick Bastiat and this beautifully complex world that brings food to our table, and how no bureaucrat could possibly conceive of the infinite complexity of that. And I was telling that to Joel, and Joel's like, well, hold on. When it comes to beef processing, the opposite is actually true. It's a completely fragile, centralized system where you don't know where your hamburger is coming from. You don't know which cow it is, because it's actually a countless number of cows that all get centralized into this process. So if there is a health problem, there's no way to actually hold people accountable. Versus if your community and your family has been getting beef from the farmer the next county over, and maybe your parents did before him, and maybe everyone you know gets that, you know where that's coming from. You know that this guy has a reputation for producing safe food. That's sort of the model that a lot of these Maha folks are advocating, and I think it's a powerful way to understand about it. Again, it's not. I don't think we should start banning things. I don't want to go after factory farms. I just want competition. I want a level playing field. I don't want the regulatory process to punish local farmers at the expense of bigger farms, because there is scalability. And we as economists understand that if we want to keep the world fed, we're going to have both. We're going to have decentralization, and I'm sure I'm not an ag economist, but I'm sure scale matters when it comes to the production of some goods. And again, so like I don't want them to start regulating farms. I want them to free up farmers to create things local and healthy.
Exactly. Yeah. I have nothing against lab grown meat. I say go right ahead. But the second you want to start banning um, the capitalist acts between consenting adults, well, then you're just the tyrant you pretend to be protecting us from. You had an amazing second episode with Senator Rand Paul, Dr. Fauci's worst nightmare. I want to go through a few parts of that episode. What evidence, if any, do you believe there is for the lab leak theory?
So I just watched my friend Matt Ridley have this debate at the Soho Forum in New York City, and to me, as and he listed, and you can watch this online. It's worth doing if you want to really get into the details. And what he basically says is, it is is it just a coincidence that the one lab that was financed by the government to do gain of function research, that had asked for funding specifically to make these kind of coronavirus weaponized viruses, um, is it an accident that that is where this virus broke out? And maybe it is, but it seems almost statistically impossible to believe that a natural occurrence from a bat that would have whose origins would have been thousands of miles away from where Wuhan um, is is possible. My take as an economist who very much believes in public choice, and this is a conversation I was having with Matt Ridley on my show at least 2 years ago. He had just written a book with Elena Chan called Viral, about trying to figure out the origins of COVID, and he was less skeptical than me. But what I said to him, and this is after some of these FOIA emails had come out, where Fauci and his colleagues are desperately trying to smear people who are suggesting it came from a lab. To me, the cover up tells me all I need to know. I'm 100% confident it came from a lab because they were so desperately trying to cover up anyone that suggested that it came from a lab. The culpability of that. You mentioned Rand Paul in the episode that I did with him. I think we shot it about 6 months ago, and he was the ranking member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and facing all sorts of roadblocks to get documents that can come as close as we'll ever get to categorically proving that this came from a lab and that the US government financed it and that they're still financing this form of gain of function research. Um, he is now the incoming chairman of that committee. And presumably, if he gets someone at the Justice Department that's willing to cooperate with him, um, we will get Fauci in jail, but we'll also get the documents that show us the food chain of who Fauci's boss is, because Fauci's not the ringleader here. I think you're going to go deep into the intelligence community. You're going to go deep into the military industrial complex and discover that this stuff was standard operating procedure, that was very much engineered by our government, supposedly to keep us safe from biosecurity threats. But then somehow we ended up doing this in Wuhan, China. Riddle me that. I don't quite get it.
They're always keeping us safe. It's
Yep.
amazing to watch. George Wallace gave a speech in sometime in the 60s at UCLA, and he was talking about the benefits of Jim Crow and the benefits of segregation. How what you're essentially doing is you're protecting the lower IQ population from the exploitation of the higher IQ population. So when anyone tells me, you have people like, Phil Magnus
Yes.
at, he has a great book, and it's titled The 1619 Project, A Critique, and he summarizes the work. Oh, heavens, it's been a while. The guy's name I want to say is George Fitzhugh. And this guy, George Fitzhugh, is saying, these slaves, if you stop enslaving them, they have to find their own job. They have to develop their own skills. They have to find their own house. They have to find their own clothes. They have to, find somewhere that all their family members can gather. They have that here. They have to, fend for themselves in many cases. They have protection on the plantation. They get this guaranteed life of security rather than the exploitation of the dog eat dog competitive free market. You have the ultimate case of paternalism in the form of enslavement. You're much more likely to die risking your life in a factory than you are on the plantation where the slave owner wants to keep you safe. The reason I bring these two horrible examples up is because realize that once someone has total control over you, they will use any rationalization, whether it's lockdowns, whether it's forming a blockade on the people of Yemen, starving hundreds of thousands of them to death, whether it's killing people in Gaza or Iraq, or Churchill's blockade on the German people in the First World War, these people will always come up with a justification. So we get extremely indefensible in one certain, I guess you could call it smoking gun, which Rand Paul mentions, Project Defuse. What was Project Defuse?
Project Diffuse was an effort by what is his name? The Peter Daszak. It was a proposal put forward to DARPA, basically the research arm of Homeland Security, to create precisely the kind of virus that emerged as COVID, and allegedly this uh, proposal was rejected. And Rand Paul's point in the documentary is that he believes that the Bat Lady, she and Peter Daszak proceeded to go ahead and do that research. And the most outrageous thing to him is that all of these agencies that had received this proposal would have been aware of this proposal. There's countless bureaucrats in all of these agencies that rejected this proposal, and yet none of them spoke up when a virus that looked exactly like what Peter Daszak was proposing to create in a lab actually emerged as a pandemic. And to me, again, this is the cover up to me, without knowing nearly as much as Rand Paul knows, is the bureaucratic behavior to prevent a narrative that would make the bureaucrats culpable for a global pandemic that killed countless people. To me, tells me that they probably did what they're hiding. And I'm thinking about this as in terms of classic bureaucratic behavior. You cover your ass. That's what you do. And you keep the projects going, and you deny. There's a reason that Anthony Fauci has been in government his entire professional career, because he's very good at being an apparatchik. He's not very good at being a scientist, and he's not very good at being honest, but he's a great apparatchik.
That was the most amazing thing because I saw it at the time, but your documentary, The Cover Up, part 2 of it does an excellent job of cutting to the scene where, I guess Fauci, I forget what the first exchange they had was, but Rand Paul says, "You know that lying to Congress is a felony. You said that the EcoHealth Alliance and NIH never funded gain of function research in the Wuhan lab of virology. Would you like to retract that statement?" He goes, "No, I didn't lie about that at all. Up and down the chain, this has not been called gain of function." And then Rand Paul lifts up a piece of paper and says, "You guys define gain of function as increasing a viral capability to go from one species to another or transmute. I forget the exact wording. But you have Fauci saying that it doesn't count as gain of function when you increase the functionality of a virus to travel from animals to human beings." It was just amazing. And just so people can look into this Diffuse project, here is the quote from Rand Paul. "At least 15 federal agencies knew from the beginning of the pandemic that EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology were seeking federal funding in 2018 to create a virus genetically very similar, if not identical, to COVID-19, said Ranking Member Paul. Disturbingly, not one of these 15 agencies spoke up to warn us that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has been pitching this research. Absolutely unbelievable. Anything else that we could learn from either Rand Paul or Jay Bhattacharya?
So one of the things that sort of inspired me to go down this rabbit hole, which is relevant to what you were talking about some of the more odious elements of progressivism, is the elitism of scientism, and this is core to Frederick Hayek's critique of central planning. And he supposedly lost the debate with Keynes, although I feel like at this point he's been redeemed on that question. But after he had this debate about macroeconomic manipulation of the economy, so-called Keynesianism, he went back and started digging into the philosophy of science, and ultimately decided that the problem with central planning is something that he calls scientism. There is a book, for you dorks in the audience that want to dig a little bit deeper. Frederick Hayek has a book called The Counter-Revolution of Science, where he critiques, primarily it's a critique of scientism, but it's fundamentally a critique of the father of socialism, who was not Marx. It was a French aristocrat named Saint Simon. And Saint Simon had this idea that you could replace the market, this process of people figuring out what they want to accomplish with their lives, with a scientific tribunal that would actually be housed. And he's talking about engineers and physicists and other scientists. Tell me if this sounds familiar. And he would house this tribunal in a temple built in the name of Sir Isaac Newton. So he was going to turn science into a religion, and he was going to replace human action with central planning. And it was all under the guise of science. It was all under the guise of putting people that are smarter than you and I in charge of our lives for us. That has been the enemy ever since. And Marx comes along and makes it about class struggle. He makes it inherently violent, that you actually had to kill a lot of people in order to get to the promised land. But Saint Simon's was just, it was this arrogant elitism that certain people are meant to rule, and the rest of us are somehow inferior. And that morphed and mutated into some of the more odious forms of progressivism, including eugenics and everything else. But that is still the philosophy that we're fighting. Our free people, with their personal knowledge, their personal abilities, their personal dreams and desires, cooperating with other free people. Is that the best way to organize society? Is that where the good stuff comes from? Or does it need to be organized and manipulated and forced down our throats from the top? And to me, this is an opportunity. We're talking about various aspects. I couldn't be happier that there's this movement of people that are mostly coming over from the left, and it's an anti-war movement. It's guys like Jimmy Dore and Glenn Greenwald, and Joe Rogan, I guess I would put into that category, and I could go on and on and on. It's the Maha folks that are suddenly waking up to the fact that regulatory capture allows for corporations to literally poison our food. All of these is an opportunity that I think there's going to be a political realignment between what I'm calling anti-authoritarians, and I'm including libertarians into that group, people that are skeptical of never-ending war, people that are skeptical of lockdowns, people that are skeptical of the speech police, you know the list, versus authoritarians. And the authoritarians might be Kamala Harris, they might be Liz Cheney. Apparently they're the same now. And to me, I think it's pretty clarifying who the enemy is. And I would just implore fellow libertarians to take seriously the potential of building a broad coalition with anti-authoritarians. We're not going to agree on everything, but let's find issues that we can agree on, like less war, like free speech. I mean, these used to be pretty obvious American values. I think that's a pretty cool thing. And I'm strangely optimistic after 5 years of just an authoritarian hellscape where I thought we had lost liberty forever. But this is the counter revolution. This is the grassroots backlash, and we need to engage and channel, and hopefully it's an opportunity for libertarians to enlighten people on how freedom works and how free people can solve problems without these our betters telling us how to live our lives.
Excellent points. Two more questions for you. Let's end with two softballs, because this has been very, very detailed and complex. I absolutely really enjoyed this. What is your favorite part of my book, Domestic Imperialism: 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism?
I like the first story that we talked about. The nightclub shooting and the cover up that ensued. And we were told that it was an act of hate. when in fact it was a classic act of blowback from foreign policy. I remember still when Ron Paul was booed off that stage when he schooled Rudy Giuliani. But that is such an obvious point that I think Frederick Bastiat will get. There are unintended consequences to your actions, and they can be deadly. That is my favorite story in that book.
Why did Keith Olbermann call you the second worst person in the world?
By the way, the first worst person in the world was Rupert Murdoch. So I guess I guess I can aspire to be number one. That's back when I was supposedly one of the leaders of the Tea Party movement, and we had these radical ideas like we shouldn't spend money we don't have, and we should get back to the constitutional liberties that were promised us by our founders, and Keith found that just reprehensible.
Matt Kibbe, thank you so much for your time. Everyone, check out freethepeople.org and this excellent documentary, part 2. I'm going to watch that probably 10 times, titled The Cover Up, courtesy of Blaze TV. Thanks to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Kibbe, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir.